America's center of power changed, and with it, the dynamics of the political landscape. The consequences will reverberate locally, in Florida, on Capitol Hill, and on the global stage. Voters demanded change on the issues that mattered most: the economy, immigration, and social issues. Now, News 4 Jax goes beyond the headlines with political analysts who provide unique context and perspective. Experts focused on the issues making headlines. This is Politics and Power.
Thousands of federal jobs are being eliminated. They are being cut at a frantic pace. President Trump's Department of Government Efficiency has adopted a slash-and-burn approach to the firings. Business analysts say DOGE is not being methodical, not efficient, doing things with little concern about the impact on public health and safety, let alone the impact on the economy, and the fact that people's lives are being destroyed. Can the same thing happen here in Florida? There are concerns. Governor DeSantis taking a page right out of Elon Musk's playbook. DeSantis announced he wants to set up a DOGE-like task force here in the Sunshine State. He wants to cut spending and target bureaucracy. The governor's rationale? For too long, nobody's cared about the taxpayers, much less the next generation, who is ultimately going to have to pay for all of the mismanagement, he says, that we have seen over these many, many years. The Democrats say the GOP has been in control of Florida's government for nearly 30 decades. So who's responsible for all that waste? Look in the mirror, they say, Governor DeSantis, you have it all wrong. Welcome to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton. Joining me, political analyst Sean Frieder. Good day. Welcome. Good to have you here.
Always good to be here.
So, Sean, DeSantis is following Elon Musk's lead. He is setting up a panel that will review about 900 state positions, university spending, local government spending, and the need for about 70 state boards and commissions. The governor's rationale: he says for too long, nobody has cared about the taxpayers, much less the next generation, who is ultimately going to have to pay for all of the mismanagement that we have seen over these many, many years. Is he forgetting something? State Dems reminded him when they fired back, saying, hold your horses, Governor DeSantis. If there's a problem, it's because you Republicans have been in charge and have been doing things wrong here in sunny old Florida. Look, the GOP has held the governor's office since Jeb Bush was elected in 1988 and has controlled both chambers of the legislature since 1996.
I mean, this is one of those things where they're correct that for the last 30 years, this has been pretty much a one-party rule at the state level. So if we're looking for mismanagement and waste, it depends on what level you're looking to find it. If we're talking about things that are approved directly by the state legislature, done by the state executive branch, that's the Republican Party. That's his own party that he's talking about. And that's where the big money would be if there's big money to be found in terms of saving dollars through eliminating waste. There's other places, of course, listed there: university boards, local government spending. Now, what you could do there is more difficult, more limited, and probably smaller amounts of waste, whatever you might find there. There you could say that there's maybe decision-making that goes beyond what the exclusively Republican-run government at the state level has done. But again, this is one of those things where when we talk about waste, we'd like to get rid of a lot of waste if it's out there, not small amounts. The stuff at the university and the local level, small amounts, and there's checks and balances built in that make it much more difficult to just, you can't snap your fingers and get rid of that waste.
All right, there's another faction here, which we'll get to here in a second, but let's talk about the politics of all this. State Democratic Party Chair Nikki Fried was a little more forceful with the governor. She says Ron DeSantis needs to shut his damn mouth. Republicans have been in total control of Florida's government for nearly 30 years, and he wants to talk about government waste. Doesn't Florida, by all counts, have one of the leanest governments in the nation? Because when you do look at things, it does compare to the other 49 states.
It does. It's a purposefully lean government. It's, again, what you would get if you have several decades of the party being the party of lean government, being in control. This is something that you kind of always worry about when people talk about looking for waste. As a political scientist, when I hear the word waste, precisely because it's such a good idea to eliminate waste, by definition, we're calling it something that no one wants. It's waste. It should just be gone. But it's also like promising chocolate in the drinking fountain. It's an easy way to sound like you're doing very good things. Actually finding legitimate waste is difficult because this is not the first time people have talked about doing audits at either the Florida level or the federal government level. Audits happen all the time. They happen slowly, regularly by trained officials. And so when you come in and try and find a new round of waste, it's not necessarily clear you're going to find as much as the taxpayer might envision you'd find, or you might end up cutting into things that aren't actually waste.
All right, so if I'm not mistaken here, Isn't the governor duplicating efforts? Because I believe Florida already has a government efficiency task force that was approved statewide by voters in 2006, and it was part of a state constitutional amendment and is required to meet every 4 years for the purpose of developing recommendations to improve governmental operations and reduce costs. That said, wouldn't this new department be a waste?
So it's a reduplication of efforts in the sense that DOGE itself at the federal level was somewhat of a reduplication of efforts. The Office of Management and Budget already existed within the executive branch. It was their role to kind of work on behalf of the executive branch to figure out what should be spent, what not. So something like that already exists at the federal level. Something like this already does exist at the state level. I think in what you read there, the key is probably the meet every 4 years. That's maybe a reasonable period of time to go in, look at waste that's accumulated since the last 4 years, do it all over again, but it doesn't necessarily fit with the timeline if what you're trying to do is capitalize on the potential popularity amongst Republicans with DOGE now.
Is this politics at play?
I think at least it's always politics at play when you do these things, but when you look at, as you say, reduplication of efforts, the fact that it's still not exactly clear what a Florida DOGE would mean. I mean, to a certain extent, it would be encouraging that they're talking about a panel. This is not what we've seen set up over the last couple months happening at the federal level. So if we had official panels with people confirmed into those positions and they were taking many months to do that, this would be something that maybe could have some promise to it. On the other hand, if this is something that moves very quickly, and that seems like that's more of the effort. If there's something about DOGE that's novel, it's the speed with which it's happening. It's maybe the control of some of the people at the higher levels, at least at the federal level. If that's reduplicated at the state level, that seems like that's something novel, but that's also something that might not be about waste. It might be more about politics.
Like getting into certain agendas. So let's flesh that out. Back up and discuss Governor DeSantis' rationale here. He says, we were DOGE before DOGE was cool. He wants to cut spending and target bureaucracy. He's setting up a panel that will review about 900 state positions, university spending, local government spending, and the need for about 70 state boards and commissions. Is there, in the grand scheme of things, a lot of fat to trim?
You know, this is one of those questions that I can't answer. Maybe there is, maybe there isn't. There's probably very few people that can answer. This is the kind of thing, if you perform an audit, private or public, it takes a long time. You need a lot of people involved who are professionally trained in finding that money. They need to be able to talk to agency heads, university boards to figure out what's waste, what's not. If you're coming in as an outsider, if this is another concern that might be coming with Florida DOGE, if you're talking about using large language models that we've been calling AI to try and find some of this, a large language model is not going to know the difference between something that could be waste but isn't versus something that doesn't look like waste but is. So this is something that you need to do over a long period of time, plan, and hopefully that's what happens. But again, the kind of defining feature of DOGE so far has been to do the Silicon Valley ethos of things, move fast, break things, and hopefully that doesn't happen at the state level.
All right, so advocacy groups say, look, DeSantis is doing nothing short of what I said before was political theater. Jared Nordland, who is the Florida State Director of Unidos US. It's a Latino civil rights organization. He basically didn't mince words, and he said that the governor is ignoring real problems. Here's what he said. Florida faces real urgent problems to solve. Families struggling with the highest rise in the cost of living in the country. High school students unable to read at an 8th grade level. A fifth of seniors experiencing homelessness. Red tide polluting our beaches. Policies that are increasingly hostile to communities of color and working people. Yet instead of addressing these urgent issues, the governor is laser focused on cutting bloat from a bureaucracy he and his party built, mismanaged, and weaponized against Floridians. Does he have a better point?
I mean, this speaks to the other half of government efficiency. What we're talking about is both we want to spend less money on things we don't want to do. There's also things we need to do that we may actually need to spend more money on. Efficiency is not just all about cutting. It's about planning for manageable growth. It's about growing the economy. And some of the things on that list right there are things that Florida has fallen behind other states in the nation on. As DeSantis himself said, they were DOGE before DOGE was cool. They have been maybe not doing the Florida DOGE program, but they have been looking to keep the government fairly lean compared to other other states. In some cases, that might be efficient. In other cases, that might mean not providing necessary programs that other states have to help people that are poor, to increase job improvement and training, things like this that we don't think about very much. It's not much that you talk about to try and gain attention, but DOGE does get attention. This other stuff that we might not be spending money on, that's also an important part of the conversation, but we're not having that conversation.
All right, back to whether or not this is agenda-driven. DeSantis wants to ensure that colleges and universities here in Florida are good stewards of tax dollars. He's asking for an independent audit of their finances and what he calls the DOGing of the state university system. Much of their attention would be rooting out diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And he said, if you want to do some of this, go to Cal Berkeley, go to some of these other places. Some of the ideological studies stuff, we just want to prune that and get that out, and we want to make sure that these universities are really serving the classical mission of what a university should be, and that's not to impose ideology. It's really to teach students how to think and to prepare them to be citizens of our republic. Sean, Florida made it illegal in 2023 for the state's universities and colleges to have DEI programs. Again, duplicating efforts.
Potentially. I mean, I think that the goal here might be to find things that are hidden under budget numbers at universities where, maybe there's a DEI program, now there's not one, but maybe they moved that money to a different department. Ostensibly, a Florida DOGE might look for that kind of movement and trying to cut this down at a second level. But again, a large language model that would be, as far as we can tell, what actually would be rooting through these systems isn't going to know the difference between something that's named a clever way to avoid scrutiny versus something that's, if it says DEI, it might cut it directly, but that's the problem. They've already gone through that step if you're imagining that people are trying to hide this money. And, the other thing that brought up there, the classical education, I mean, classical education is about more than just skill building. It's about learning how to think, as the governor said. And that's something that is not necessarily in line with, getting rid of DEI. That's not something that's necessarily taught in classrooms. That's more of a staff-based thing. That's administrative. If we're talking about getting universities back to their mission, some of our overwhelming push towards STEM and AI training to begin with is maybe leaving some of the other parts of that classical mission, the learning how to think, on the vine.
I don't think that there's any arguing that DeSantis is convinced that university employees are working to hide those DEI programs, and with the audits that he wants to cut classes and university faculty and staff that he believes are not maximizing value for its students.
I mean, I think that is ultimately where this is going. But if he thinks that a large language model is going to find that stuff, it's not. It's going to be these slow, kind of boring aspects of government that were to find it. If he wants to, go through that 4-year panel that meets during that period of time and direct them to look closely at universities, interview some of the people in the administrative level, see where that money's moved around. That's how you would traditionally find these things. A computer program won't find much, but it does sound interesting.
But he still thinks that there's woke in Florida's universities and college classes, and he wants to return to, that classical education. So he's using this as a vehicle to do that. He's going to do that, and maybe at the staff level you find something at the administrative level. The faculty levels may be a different question. I mean, there's protections that exist even after, some of those protections have been weakened in the state of Florida compared to others. You have tenure, you have the post-tenure review process for university faculty, and you have to show some pretty clear evidence of falling behind what the standards are in order to be brought down in that way. So if we're talking about what happens in the classroom, I can't see this having much of an immediate, if any, kind of impact. That would require more careful, direct human auditing, which this doesn't appear to be. What's the reaction on college campuses right now to, what they're hearing?
Panic. I mean, I think if you look at the markets right now, at the national level, which we'll get to, you see economic sell-offs, you see concern. Markets don't like uncertainty, and neither do administrative boards. Universities don't like that uncertainty. So if you had programs, if you had research dollars that were coming through the university, you don't know if that money is going to continue to flow. I've personally had to tell students that things that they were maybe planning on doing over the summer isn't available anymore because the NSF is no longer funding that thing or has put a pause on it. So when people are thinking about waste, some of this stuff might be wasteful. Some of this stuff might be handicapping us as we're trying to build those skills for students that DeSantis talked about.
Is this the wrong lesson for students?
The right lesson is to do things.
Or is that too subjective a question?
I mean, the right lesson, I think, for all students, when we're talking about thinking critically involves moving slowly. There's an emphasis with AI, with the increasing way that we do things generally, that puts emphasis on doing things very quickly. But the lesson here for students should be slow down, don't speed up, especially if you're going to do things that could very well break a lot of aspects of government or slow them down ultimately.
I think that's the whole lesson of this conversation here today as we get into the next phase of what's happening federally, which we will do. When Politics and Power continues, Elon Musk's role in the Trump administration gains even more clarity. And there are major questions about DOGE's wall of savings and canceled contracts. Both are meant to cut government waste, but studies show they may not be saving the government any money at all. And DOGE is having trouble backing up many of its claims of fraud because it misinterpreted data. Then there are a myriad of lawsuits questioning its very legality, how it's operating, and even who is really in charge. That and more when Politics and Power continues. Welcome back to Politics and Power. I'm Bruce Hamilton. My guest, political analyst Sean Frieder. The rapid dismantling of the U.S. federal bureaucracy is nothing short of chaotic and potentially dangerous. Some observers say there is absolute incompetence among the decision makers, the people at DOGE, Elon Musk. DOGE employs a blunt force approach toward the wholesale firing of workers who are classified as probationary workers. Sean, how do you fire the staff that handles America's nuclear weapons? The scientists trying to fight the growing and worsening bird flu outbreak, and officials responsible for supplying electricity, the people who forecast hurricanes on the heels of hurricane season. One Republican congressional aide granted anonymity to speak candidly put it this way: I thought we were supposed to be in a new era of meritocracy, not the indiscriminate firing of people. I mean, we're putting the nation's health and safety at risk.
It's one of those things where you ask the question, how many people need to be working for those agencies? And, is the answer 100, 200, 500? We don't know those answers because they're really difficult to pinpoint. And you'd imagine that hopefully over the course of years, decades, building up expertise to these agencies, the agencies themselves probably would know the most. Now, if you want to come in as an outside group and figure out, did those agencies get that number right? Maybe they didn't. Again, cutting waste is good, and it's an exercise that's necessary. The government should go through always from time to time. This is no different. Again, here is the speed, the method, the personnel that they're using for this. We're moving fast, we're breaking things. It's that Silicon Valley ethos, again, that Musk is familiar with, and that might work when you are running a private company. I mean, given what's happened with Twitter after he took that over, the losses that happened there, you would be worried about someone who comes in saying, let's cut a lot of things and see what happens later, to be controlling that process. So to go through and see, maybe we don't need all those people, those agencies, but it's impossible to imagine how we would determine that over the course of a handful of weeks with maybe a few dozen scattered interns here and there and someone that doesn't actually technically run DOGE at the helm of DOGE or not. It's all very confusing.
You don't do it willy-nilly and you go, oh, we got rid of all the people that handle our nuclear weapons. Gosh, we got to get them back because we don't know, who's playing with the toys now. It doesn't make sense. There are reports that there's absolute incompetence and inexperience among many of the decision makers. How does that happen? I heard there's a report of a 19-year-old who was making some of these decisions. I mean, I just don't understand that. And I don't understand how the American public isn't questioning more of this, how some people are just going, well, I mean, that's what we asked for. And, the president and Elon Musk know what they're doing.
Some of this is based on personal trust. I mean, again, if you naturally trust Trump, if you trust Musk, you can say, I'm sure that whatever they're doing is a good idea. Again, we're talking about a country where, about 32% of the adult voting age public that's eligible voted for Trump, which leaves a lot of people that chose not to vote at all or voted for someone else. So for, a good chunk of the public, trust alone is not going to be enough to say, I'm sure that what they're doing is right. And again, I think that what people are hearing is sort of the big ticket item, which is we're doing audits, we're going through, we're trying to find waste and fraud. And these sound good because they are good things. Trying to get rid of waste and fraud, they are excellent things. No one would disagree with that. It's the belief that you can do this quickly that's concerning for a lot of people.
But then you hear from some of these federal workers who say, I would have never voted for him had I known that this was going to happen. And I think that there's so much smoke and mirrors that some people don't understand the reality of what's going on. You can't ignore the fact that while Elon Musk and his young aides at DOGE wield their axe and send out these sanitized termination letters, the Trump administration may be on the precipice of running up one monumental bill. If it's found that they were filed illegally, the Trump administration, which has adopted an attitude that is not beholden in some respects to the law, may find itself with one big legal bill. There's another problem.
Yeah, I mean, like, these are small amounts of money that you're going to find. I mean, if you look at what's on the website, some of what's been on the website has been taken off the website, it's been changed, because, again, this is what happens when you move quickly. But the stuff on the website, you know, it adds up to an amount that you could start to undermine that amount seriously with the legal bills adding up. You might have to have extra judges actually available to look at these cases. You know, some of the stuff that they're doing is clearly within the realm of clear, perfect legality, that they're firing certain workers. Other workers, they have wrongful termination lawsuits, and these are going to go through, you know, in the hundreds and the thousands, tens of thousands as time goes on. That costs money. That's a lot of time that the federal government, the Department of Justice, is spending on these cases, and they're necessary cases. A lot of these are being handled in ways that wouldn't have been normal 4 months ago.
But when you take people out of the DOJ, when you take the media out of the equation because you don't like the way certain media covers you, you know that the stories that come out aren't going to necessarily be truthful because there are people that you have there that are going to cover you the way you want yourself covered. People aren't going to get the true story.
If you look at the way that the DOJ has handled itself already, if you look at the appointees that have gone into the FBI, some of these other investigatory arms of the government, you know, again, you usually put people in there that are career experts. They've spent most of their lives doing this stuff.
And loyalists.
We're putting loyalists in there increasingly, and, you know, that's something that, again, if Democrats or Republicans are doing that, we don't want loyalists, especially at the rank and file level, and that's one thing that we're concerned about. As some of these employees are being terminated, necessarily we're going to discover that we need to rehire some of them. They're not going to be available for rehiring, so they're going to bring in new people. What we're really doing is, again, inefficiency. We're getting rid of experts. We're bringing in people that need a lot of training and recruiting eventually. So it's going to look like short term, we're saving money. Long term, we're going to waste money.
Yeah. And by the way, I know who's going to write me. I know what you're going to say. This is not along any partisan lines. I'm telling it like it is. And if you don't like it, so be it. There are some people who just don't want to, look at the reality today. It would make more sense in the real world, in the business world, in a world where you want to thrive and survive, to look at individuals and the specific jobs they do. Make more sense to see who among these workers are essential, like you have been saying, who are doing their jobs and doing it well. Make more sense to see which jobs are unnecessary, which jobs duplicate efforts. Make more sense to look at the workers who are not productive and trim that part of the workforce.
If your primary goal was to save money, that's exactly what you would do. To make the government more efficient, that's exactly what you would do. If your primary goal is to cut a lot of government jobs, replace them potentially with political appointees, which would be a pretty big change in a lot of these agencies, some of the actions here make sense. If you look at the person that's currently the head of an Office of Management and Budget, Russell Vought, he has said directly in the past, verbatim quote, that he wants to see the federal workers feel traumatized, that they shouldn't want to go in the morning because they feel like they're increasingly viewed as the enemy. It's a direct quote from him. So if this is your goal, this is chaos. This is going to make people want to quit, not come in. And ultimately, though, we aren't universally against federal workers. We want them to be able to do their job on our behalf, and we want experts doing that job, not political appointees.
The question of all of this is at what cost? People aren't looking at the bigger picture here. At what economic cost? So you've got these federal workers who are going to lose their jobs. People don't understand that these federal workers support other industry jobs, and eventually this may trickle down to the economy. These layoffs themselves are not enough to trigger a recession. But if these workers don't get jobs, there are other jobs that may go begging. When those other jobs go begging, the people who own restaurants, the people who own barbershops, the people who own retail outlets may not be able to sustain their jobs, and then we're in a big economic hell.
That's right. There's a lot of problems that can arise from this. And again, we usually don't have these conversations because, if you do targeted layoffs, they're supposed to happen in waves over time so that people can retrain the people as they're leaving to take over their jobs if necessary, so that you don't have this instant economic effect at once. But, in the D.C. area, depending on how far they go with this, it probably is enough to trigger recession given the percentage of people that work in government jobs there. A lot of people don't realize a lot of the federal jobs are essentially not just remote-based in D.C., they're remote-based in 100 different cities around the country. So, there are 100 mini recessions you can imagine if that number gets large enough as well. And as you say, there's secondary, tertiary effects to this that if they can't re-find jobs, if this is something that's all happening very quickly, it's going to make it difficult for the economy to rebound, especially if you're combining that with some of the other things we might see related to tariffs, related to migration, denials, etc.
No one is arguing there is not government waste. No one is arguing about the fact that taking a long, hard look at bloated government bureaucracy is not long overdue, but there's an effective way to do it. Elon Musk says there's fraud. He and Trump said millions of dead people may be receiving fraudulent Social Security payments. So there's a contradiction because in 2023, the Inspector General's report showed information quite to the contrary. Is Musk maybe just misinterpreting the data?
In the case specifically of the Social Security fraud, which he was claiming originally that there's 150, 160-year-old people pulling Social Security checks, we know now for sure that he was misinterpreting the data. This is having to do with, again, technicalities that if you were doing this over the course of months, years, you would learn. If you do them in weeks, you might get confused by what is, in the case of Social Security, an old coding system that they use called COBOL, which is very difficult to interpret in normal coding terms. So this was them misinterpreting that there are these people receiving the checks. These are real people receiving and drawing on real checks that are not 150 and 160. And so if you see that as just one example of what could go wrong, a simple programming language misinterpretation, if you're moving in the course of weeks using interns rather than CPA certified accountants, etc., these are the kinds of mistakes that you make. And this is why we've seen $8 billion contracts on the website turn into $8 million contracts, things be taken off the website because they later discover that they weren't the waste they thought they were.
All right, let me go over those numbers again, all right? So he claimed DOGE saved some $16 billion in government contracts, almost half from a single $8 billion contract with ICE. It was actually 8 million, not 8 billion. AP did a study that shows 40% of the contracts canceled by DOGE won't result in any savings. It's time for accountability because people will believe what he and Trump say, but those numbers are not true. I have to ask this, Sean, who's making a lot of money from government contracts all the while when taking that chainsaw mentioned earlier to these government offices? Who's really reaping the benefits from DOGE? Let me give one example, and people can draw your own conclusion. The FAA fired 400 employees and agreed to start testing SpaceX's Starlink internet system. Conflict of interest there?
I mean, almost certainly from a legal perspective, you'd worry. I mean, conflict of interest is what appears to be a conflict of interest. Maybe there isn't one, but you try to avoid the appearance of one. If he was confirmed, vetted by the Senate in normal ways that you would imagine someone with this kind of senior level access to these files was, you might be able to talk about entering blind trusts and somehow separating his finances over a long period of time. If you do this very quickly, there's no way you can do this. And this is similar to Trump's lack of blind trusting his own interests in both terms that he's been in so far. So you worry about conflict of interest. I think the other thing that you worry about here, because sure, you are worried about government contracts maybe going to Musk that wouldn't have. Over his career, his companies have taken about $40 billion in government contracts. And again, some of that, most of that might be very, very useful. So this isn't necessarily saying that's $40 billion of fraud, but it does mean that he has a close connection. The other thing a close connection does is it means that not just trying to find new contracts, but you have vendettas. You have organizations that have investigated you in the past. U.S. Aid oversaw some of those people that has investigated some of Musk's work in the past. So when you wonder why are we moving very quickly at U.S. Aid and FAA, which don't have a lot of money to be saved compared to some of these other groups, you start to look at other sorts of motives, and I think spite is one of them.
And you've got to question his interest in the German government and some of the other European governments. You've got to question his $290 million investment in Donald Trump's election. Look, you're going to believe what you want. You really are. You're going to question me and my motives here. My motive is the truth. And my job is to ask questions. Your job is to go ahead and to vet all this information and to come to your own conclusion. I'm not going to convince you one way or the other. Your job is to go out there and look at all of the different sources out there and come to your own conclusion and believe what you want, not to listen to one pundit or the other. There are organizations out there that deliver you the news that have an agenda. There is no agenda here except to get to the truth. Sean, appreciate you. So, Caleb, do me a favor, come up on one. Let me just end on this note. No one wants taxpayer dollars wasted. Everyone wants necessary government services available. Everything needs to be proportional. The response to make that happen needs to be proportional and done rationally without upending this nation's or state's needs and people's lives. That said, thank you for watching Politics and Power. I appreciate you. I appreciate your ability to make your own educated decision.
See why every day more people are choosing News 4 Jax, Northeast Florida and South Georgia's #1 source for local news.